Good morning.
Good morning.
Morning, John.
Wow, what a crowd.
Yeah. So how are we looking there, Melissa?
Looking good. Everybody's in right now, so
All right,
they'll still
great.
keep
All right.
rolling in.
All right. Well, welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to have you join us this morning. We keep hoping that we're going to be able to get together and shake hands and hug each other once in a while. That's coming soon, we know, but not today. We have a great meeting lined up for you, and we're looking forward to hearing from both gentlemen this morning. My name is Harold Christ, and I'm president of Pinnell Partnership, and it's just great to be able to wake up in Pinnell County, which I get to do every morning, and it's a very special place. The sun comes up here before it hits Maricopa County, so we get a head start on you. So we have 140 people plus are joining us this morning, which is a wonderful crowd. I'd like to just take a couple of minutes for a few business points. We've got some renewing members that we'd like to recognize this morning. In the platinum category, it's the Rose Law Group, Hilgart Wilson, LeSueur Investment, Atwell, and Arcus. In the gold category, the Sunt Companies, Arizona State University, and in silver, Right-of-Way Disposal, Southwest Gas Corporation, Low Mountain Construction, Gamage and Burnham, and Wood Patel. In the government category, Pinnell County, and nonprofits, Local First Arizona, United Way of Pinnell County, Superstition Community Food Bank, Empowerment Systems, and We Serve. The individual categories are Jessica Sarkison and Emery Layton. So we have some new members joining us for the first time, ARED Management and American Resort Communities. And then also in a nonprofit category, Saddlebrook Unit 1 and an individual, Dean Barnett. I want to remind you that November, we have a great meeting that we're working on. We're not able to announce who it is quite yet because we're waiting on a couple of speakers, but you want to make sure that you keep tracking us to see the dates and the time for that. And then mark your calendars for December the 4th. That's our Elliott Pollock breakfast that we get the economic forecast from. Elliott has been doing this now for 12, 13 years, and every year is it's really a lot of fun. You'll enjoy it. So please join us for that. So without any further ado, because we've got a lot of territory we want to cover, let me introduce our panel today. We have on the vote yes on 208, David Lujan for the Arizona Center for Economic Progress. Welcome, David. And then on the vote no on Proposition 208, we have Sean McCarthy from the Arizona Tax Research Association. And our moderator today, of course, is Jordan Rose from the Rose Law Group. Jordan?
Thanks, Harold. I appreciate it. This is really exciting for us to host a debate. I wonder, people are starting to turn their cameras off now, but the people who are on camera, why don't you raise your hand if you're undecided on 208 so that these guys can see who they're talking to. All right, nobody's going to admit for undecided because that would mean you weren't reading very much, right? Okay, all right. Well, anyhow, let's get going. So the format today is going to be a little different than what we normally do. We're going to have the yes on 208 side spend 15 minutes and talk to us, and then we'll have the no on 208 side talk to us for 15 minutes. And then we'll ask questions. I'll ask questions. If you have questions during their conversation, I'd really encourage you to pop up that chat and start asking things and putting things in there. So let's do that and let's be lively about it. So I am, we don't have any mutes like at the national level, and we don't have anything like that. We're not gonna cut you off. You're not gonna interrupt each other, but I am gonna tell you at 15 minutes to stop. So David, I have a lot of respect for you, and let's hear,
Thank you, Jordan. Hi, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity. As was said, I'm David Lujan. I'm the director of the Arizona Center for Economic Progress, and we are one of 5 organizations behind Proposition 208. The others are Children's Action Alliance, the Arizona Interfaith Network, Arizona Education Association, and Stand for Children. And together, we've been working together for about the last 4 years to try and bring forward a proposal to address the funding crisis in Arizona's public schools. And as you may recall, we tried a similar effort in 2018 that was unsuccessful. And I think the day after we were removed from the ballot by the Supreme Court, we held a press conference and said that our coalition was going to stick together because we still saw that the schools have a funding crisis and that we were going to wait to see what happened over the course of the next 2 years to see whether the legislature or others brought forward a plan to address that funding crisis. And if they did not, that we would be back in 2020. And so here we are in 2020 with Proposition 208. And we're doing it because over the past decade, no state in the country has cut more funding from its public education system than Arizona. And our schools are operating today with less funding than they had not only in 2008, but less funding than they had in 2001. And really for the past 20 years, our schools have been in the bottom 10 in the country in funding. And we're currently 48th in the country in per pupil funding. And we're feeling the ramifications of that in the form of one of the worst teacher shortage crises in the country. And new data was released just a few weeks ago that shows that teacher shortage crisis is getting worse, with more than 1,700 classrooms across the state without a qualified certified teacher. And we also have some of the largest class sizes in the country. And so Proposition 208 is designed to address those. It will raise an estimated $940 million in annual revenue. That's according to an estimate we had by the Arizona Department of Revenue. Revenue that will be voter protected, that the politicians at the state capitol cannot touch, and that will have strict accountability that can only be used for very specific purposes. And those purposes include increasing teacher salaries, but also increasing the salaries of other non-administrative, and the initiative is very specific that it cannot go to any administrative costs, but it can be used to increase the salaries of other non-administrative school personnel that play a role in educating our students. So people like school counselors, school nurses, classroom aides, bus drivers, cafeteria workers, the facility workers, all the people that play such a role in educating students. So the money goes to that, also to reducing class sizes, because when you can fill those positions, you can also reduce class sizes. And it will also more than double state funding for career and technical education. And these are programs, as many of you know, that are so critical, particularly in high schools, to provide students with the skills that they need to fill critical workforce jobs that are in high demand across our state. And this will more than double state funding for career and technical education. And so we're excited that Arizonans will have an opportunity to vote on this, are already voting on this November. Arizonans have been very enthusiastic in this, and we think there's been a lot of polls that have shown that, and we've done a lot of polls ourselves that consistently show that Arizonans strongly support this proposal. But I often say that it's not a poll, but the biggest indicator was the fact that we had more than 435,000 Arizonans come together in the middle of a pandemic to put their signatures on petitions to put this on the ballot. They went out there with masks and gloves and disposable pens and did whatever they could to get this on the ballot. And if you ask people who are out there collecting signatures, they'll tell you how easy it was to get people to sign, how enthusiastic people were to sign this, because people are frustrated with the lack of funding in our public schools across the state. They're frustrated with a lack of a solution, with others not coming forward with better solutions, and they want something done about it. And that's what Proposition 208 does. And it's also, I think, and I think most of us believe that it's an investment in our economy. It's an investment in our future workforce. You can ask any economist, whether it's in Arizona or nationally, what's one of the most effective strategies that states can do to improve their workforce and to invest in their economy, and that's to invest in their public education system. And that's what a number of our neighboring states have actually been doing in recent years, and a number of states across the country have been increasing their investments in public education. And even though Arizona has put a little bit more money back into our system in the last couple of years, it's not anything compared to what other states are doing. And Arizona has actually been falling further and further behind the rest of the country when it comes to education funding. So we think this is a investment in jobs. It's an investment in businesses. It's an investment in our economy. And particularly in rural Arizona, I think this is so good because, as many of you know, in many of our rural communities across Arizona, our public schools are among the largest employers in small towns across Arizona. And just to put some specific numbers on this, I mentioned that this will raise an estimated $940 million in revenue each year. The revenue gets distributed based on each school district's student population. So we can, using that figure, we can estimate and get a pretty good number of how much the school districts in your area will receive. And so Pinal County, if Proposition 208 passes, will stand to gain an additional $38 million in new annual revenue into their public schools every year. And so that's $38 million that mainly goes to wages and new jobs, because when you look at the initiative, this is for increasing wages and increasing positions in jobs. So when you have some of the largest employers in Pinal County, which is our public schools, with the resources to increase wages and to hire some of the positions that they've had to cut over the years, that's $38 million in revenue coming into Pinal County that will go into people's pockets so that they can go out into the communities and buy things in the stores and go out to eat in restaurants when we can go out to eat in restaurants again. That's people in Florence and Eloy and Casa Grande who work for the public schools or who will be working for the public schools, because those school districts can now hire positions that they've been unable to hire before, that can now have more purchasing power and more economic power to buy homes and to do other business and grow the economies in rural communities. And so that's a huge benefit for rural Arizona. The other strong benefit, particularly for rural communities, I believe, is the more than doubling of state funding for career and technical education, as I mentioned before. These are such critical jobs, particularly in rural communities, to fill workforce needed jobs in those communities. And unfortunately, career and technical education has borne many of the cuts over the past decade. Our schools can no longer have funding that they used to have to fund, for example, 9th grade career and technical education. And this will give them that funding to do that. And so we really believe that for rural communities, this is very important. And also, the revenue mechanism, as you know, is an income tax surcharge, a 3.5% surcharge on the top 1% of wealthiest Arizonans. 99% of Arizonans will not pay a penny more with Prop 208. And that number is actually smaller in rural communities because there are very few people in that top 1% in rural communities. So I would venture to say it's probably less than half of a percentage point of people who will see a tax increase. But yet, as I mentioned, Pinal County and other rural counties, Pinal County stands to gain an estimated $38 million if Prop 208 passes. So let me just address a little bit about the income tax surcharge. As I mentioned, it's a 3.5% surcharge on the wealthiest 1%. To kind of anticipate what I'm guessing Sean's going to talk about, we hear a lot on the other side about how this will give us one of the highest top income tax rates in the country, and it will give us an uncompetitive income tax. But this only addresses the individual income tax. And on the individual income tax, our taxes are taxed at a graduated rate. So you don't pay your income tax at the top rate. All of the tax, your income, if you're in that top 1%, a portion of your income is taxed at 2.59%, about $53,000 is taxed at 2.59. Another chunk of income is taxed at 3.14, another chunk at 4.5. And so it's only the income above those thresholds that is taxed at the top rate. And so as an example, if you're a married couple in Arizona that's making $650,000 in taxable income, your state income taxes with Proposition 208 will still be less than 34 other states if you're in that top 1%. And so the thing we're hearing from the opposition that this will give us one of the highest top income tax rates, that's not taking into account what they actually pay. That's the effective tax rate. And the effective tax rate will still be below the national average and will still be below most other states. And the critical thing is we will be investing in our workforce, we'll be investing in our economy, and that's good for bringing businesses into our state. And the most important thing, when I talked about $38 million going into Pinal County and creating jobs and investing in teachers, let's not forget who's the biggest beneficiary, and that's our students, because that money is being invested into the people who are going into our schools to educate our students. And that's our future workforce. Those are students who have been going through an education system that's one of the most underfunded in the country. And think about what the harm that's already caused to our workforce over the past 20 years. And one of the best investments you can make to increase earning potential of people is to invest in education and to give them those opportunities. So we're excited about Prop 208. I think a lot of Arizonans are. And I appreciate the opportunity to just come here today and speak. And I look forward to the question and answer period afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And you told us before this that you've done no less than 50 of these over the last several months. And I can tell you must have, because you ended literally a few seconds before your 15 minutes was up. So thank you for that. Okay, I have lots and lots of questions, but I'm going to put those on pause. And Sean, your group is awesome. You guys have done some great work in the state, and both you and David have just a lot of brain cells. So give us your 15 minutes of why we should reject Prop 208 today.
Thank you, Mr. Rose. Again, I'm Sean McCarthy. I'm Senior Research Analyst at the Arizona Tax Research Association. I'm an expert in tax policy and K-12 education finance within Arizona. And I'm just so happy to be here today to talk about my two favorite things, which is tax policy and K-12 finance. But first, this is tax policy. This is a tax policy question. And so you have to begin with looking at this from a tax policy perspective. And what do we want to do with our tax policy within Arizona? And the goal of my talk today is to try to explain to you why we think that Prop 208 is both cynical and misguided. Cynical, and we think that this is just a bad way to do policymaking, and misguided because this doesn't even get schools what they want, doesn't give schools what they've been asking for. So let's start with just the basic high level. What does Prop 208 do overall? We're talking about doubling our top rate. Our top marginal income tax rate goes up 77% from 4.5% to 8%. That gives Arizona one of the top marginal rates in the country. Will be 8 or 9 depending on the breaks. So 9th highest top marginal tax rate in the United States. So we have to look at the economic consequences of that, right? Everyone knows that there's no free lunch, right? There's economic consequences associated with tax increases. So the question is, are the economic consequences worth the potential benefits? So on the consequences side, we've had several economists look at this, okay? The proposition, they'll speak generically that economists like it, but they won't name names because there's no economist that's willing to put their name on this thing and say that it's good for the economy. On our side, we'll name names, okay? Elliot Pollack, Jim Rounds, Stephen Moore, Art Laffer, the Tax Foundation, both national groups and local economists all say that this creates significant economic consequences for Arizona. The estimations are that it costs 124,000 jobs within 10 years. That may not sound like a lot to you, but what should sound a lot to you is $2.4 billion in losses in state and local taxes. This is a massive impact to county government. It's a massive impact to city government. Cities rely on state shared revenue. A lot of that comes from income tax. When you shock your income tax base, you're hurting state shared revenues. This should be something that city leaders are passionate about, something that county leaders should be paying attention to. This directly undermines your base of tax. Now, on the benefit side, what does it do for schools? Well, we know that it creates grants. We know those grants will be highly volatile. We know that most likely they will be used in the form of bonuses for staff. So we're not talking about base increased pay for teachers. We will do nothing to impact teacher to student ratios. There's no one out there suggesting that this provides the stable money that you would need to create hires. So we know that it's not going to relieve the teacher problem in Arizona, which, by the way, is a very national problem. Okay. And it also doesn't have anything that creates metrics that prove that Arizona schools will get better. So the fundamental question, if I could have you walk away today remembering anything, it's that, are you willing to make Arizona a top income tax state at the benefit of small, volatile grants for staff? Is that worth it to you? And fundamentally, we just do not think that that is worth it. But first, we should look at this from a tax policy perspective, because regardless of how sympathetic the K-12 schools are, regardless of how much you feel like we ought to spend more on schools, you first have to get your tax policy right. Your tax policy within your state needs to be sound. It doesn't matter where the money is going to. We need to make sure that in Arizona that we have a tax policy that makes sense. And we think that having a top 10 high tax rate undermines our ability to attract businesses to Arizona. It undermines our regional tax competitiveness, retiree relocations to Arizona. It undermines a lot of the things that we are dependent on in Arizona. Getting feedback from
Hold on, maybe Jimmy Kerr. Okay.
Cool. All right. So what's interesting is that Arizona used to be a top high tax state. There's this notion out there that Arizona has always been like this low tax destination. It really wasn't true. Prior to the 1990s, our top marginal rate was 7%. Our corporate income tax rate was 9%. And frankly, it didn't work particularly well. We actually collected less adjusted for population and inflation. Arizona wasn't a particularly wealthy state. We did not attract wealthy retirees. We did not attract wealthy folks. And frankly, our businesses weren't as successful. And so we actually collect more today with slightly lower rates. We've dropped rates about 35% since that time. And those low rates have worked really well for Arizona. You cannot deny the success of Arizona over the last 3 decades. Our economy has done quite well, and we've had sustained net in migration. Pinal County would not be Pinal County today, but for the growth, right? The success of Pinal County, the success of Santan Valley, those things were dependent on the growth of Arizona, the creation of jobs. That cannot be fully understood without understanding Arizona as a tax state that has tax policy that is competitive. The other thing that has significantly changed about Arizona is that we are attractive to high-end filers. Okay, you can talk about anecdotes, you can throw out this magical couple that makes $650, but the data is what really matters. And the data shows that with attractive rates, Arizona has attracted high-end filers. They're an important part of our tax base. So when I say that this impacts the tax base, we're not using made-up numbers here. We're looking at the data. The number of filers with over 500,000, and that includes both individuals as well as the businesses that they own, a lot of small businesses in Arizona, that was a rounding error prior to the 1990s. It now makes up a huge percentage of our tax base in terms of the taxes that they pay. It's gone up 400% in the last 30 years. The amount of taxes they pay went from 10% to 25%. And that ranges year to year. Sometimes it's 20%, sometimes it's 30%. It's very rangy. And that's because business profits are very rangy and capital gains is all over the place. This is a very volatile area, but they do provide roughly a quarter of the tax base. And so shocking that system, shocking that base of tax with a 77% increase will create severe economic consequences for Arizona. We also don't think that wealthy taxpayers are tied to Arizona. Okay, we do not think that there is something inherently special that makes it so they have to live in Arizona. Arizona benefits strongly from wealthy filers that choose to be in Arizona. Those people could choose other places if we make it a place that is less friendly for them. From a pure public policy perspective, we think that this is an imbalanced tax. In Arizona, we have to balance our budget. We cannot run deficits, and we need to make sure that there's a proper push-pull between the folks who pay the taxes and the folks that are demanding the services. We think that a much less cynical offer would have been, why don't we all raise taxes together and we can all pay for a tax increase for education? We think that that makes sense in a state where we all benefit from K-12, where we all have the obligation to pay for K-12. Saying that we're going to put that obligation on roughly 2 to 3% of filers on our most successful small businesses and say that it's their job now to pay for future increases to K-12, we think is bad public policy. We think that it should be borne on all Arizonans, and it should be rejected. And should be say, no, if we're gonna spend more on education, ask all of us to pay our fair share. The idea that this is only the problem for high-end filers is silly. The idea that they don't pay their fair share is not backed up in the data when this group already pays 20 to 30% each year. We also think that from a regional competitiveness standpoint, taking our high top rate to 8% doesn't particularly make sense when our top competitors are states with either no income tax, such as Texas, Washington, Nevada, Wyoming, San Diego, or states that have flat taxes, such as Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, Idaho, Montana. We're surrounded by states that have particularly competitive tax rates outside of California, and everybody essentially is vying for having a competitive tax rate. If we change the fundamentals of Arizona, then you change the fundamentals of who decides to come here or who decides to stay here in the future. Just one interesting note. You can tell that this plan was not developed by experts. Again, there's no reputable economist supporting Prop 208. The folks that were involved in the drafting of it do not have expertise in tax policy. They left out basic stuff. They left out stuff like adjusting the tax brackets for inflation, stuff that if they had experts involved, they wouldn't have missed. So by not adjusting the brackets for inflation each year, this means that there's a natural tax increase associated with inflation. It means that each year there'll be new taxpayers that are affected by this. So if you're a small business owner and your adjusted gross income was $200,000 this year, that means 15 years from now, you will be affected by this tax just as a result of inflation, because inflation moves and it changes the value of money over time. It just shows you the level of thinking that went into putting this together. Now, let's talk about the benefit side of it, because maybe you're not convinced. Maybe you think that Arizona can afford to be a high tax state. Maybe you're not convinced by the tax policy arguments because you're desperate to get money to K-12. As a K-12 finance expert, I can tell you that this will not make a marginal impact on K-12 education. We're talking about a highly volatile revenue source that dropped 4 out of the 7 years after the Great Recession. This is not money schools can count on. At best, you're talking about 3% to 7% annual bonuses at the end of the year. That is not going to materially change the way education is delivered in Arizona. It's not going to materially change the lives of our staff and teachers within Arizona. And there's no metrics to show that this is somehow going to improve the outcomes, which is what we all care about. We want our students to learn. We want them to achieve. We want them to be successful as they move on beyond K-12. You can't do that when you're not giving schools dedicated money. You're not doing that when you're not fundamentally changing the way education is delivered. And the way I think that you should know this intuitively is that this was not designed by K-12 experts. There's nobody on the yes side who is a traditional supporter of K-12 education. You don't have the School Boards Association. You don't see any school business officials out there supporting this. I don't see any school superintendents out there supporting this. The people who actually work in education, the people who try to balance the budgets and make it work every year and pay their teachers, they would not choose a revenue source this volatile. This is not a grassroots effort from schools saying, we wanted to fix education and this is how we're going to do it. If they were to do that, they would choose a revenue source that was far more sensible than this one. Okay, this was done primarily by groups like the Teachers Union. And it's being funded by out-of-state groups like Stanford Children out of Portland and the Teachers Union. This is all national out-of-state money funding this. This was not something that was born out of superintendents and business officials saying they were trying to fix Arizona K-12. As far as the revenues for Arizona, you'll hear the yes side say, most cuts in the last decade. It's interesting that almost all of their material stops in 2015. Well, the world didn't stop in 2015. Arizona did have a deep recession. You all remember, you were there. But since then, the last 6 years have been a boon for K-12 education. I'm sure you read the news, you've been following what's going on. Arizona's economy has been doing quite well. And when the Arizona's economy does quite well, it generates a lot of money that can be used for spending. So you're talking about one good year in growth will generate $1 billion in new sales tax revenue. One good year of growth might generate 500 million in new income taxes. If you want money for schools, grow your economy. That's how you get money for schools. And that growth that we've seen in the last several years has benefited K-12 education quite well. You're talking about, in the aggregate, $6.4 billion in the last 6 years has gone to K-12. The 20 by 20 teacher pay program, $650 million. The Prop 123, $350 million. These are all annual, ongoing. District additional assistance, charter additional assistance, over 350 million. Increases to capital spending through the SFB and other portals. There's been increases to K-12 across the board, and it's translated to real results because it was put in the base. It was put in monies that schools could count on. This will not do that. This is not money schools can count on. It doesn't go into base funding. It doesn't go into the formula. It's not monies that schools know that they're going to be able to get the next year. And so this will not even be nearly as significant as those other programs. And those programs have had results. Average teacher pay is going from $48,000 a year in Arizona to roughly $56,000 a year by the end of this fiscal. That's significant improvement in just a couple of years. The last 3 years, due to a strong economy, has been terrific. So the idea that our schools are dying on the vine and starving just cannot be talked about without talking about all of the recent infusions of cash. You have to acknowledge that. And we're just beginning to live in that. A lot of those infusions have been within the last 3 years. And so it's not to say that schools don't need money. Schools will always need money. Schools will always require investment, but you should get something for that. If we're going to raise taxes, if we're going to shock the economy, if we're going to shock small businesses, if we're going to shock the most successful ranchers and farmers in Pinal County, the most successful businesses in Pinal County, you should get something for that. What are you going to get? How are you going to tell me that education is going to get better? What are your metrics for success? I don't see any of that here. What I see is bonuses for staff at the end of the year that will range between 3 and 7% depending on how good this revenue source is. That to me is not worth it. So just to close, we think that Prop 208 is bad tax policy, period, dot. You do not choose bad tax policy for your state. But we think that the timing during the pandemic makes this even worse. And frankly, it doesn't benefit the beneficiaries in the way that the proponent says that it is. So it's not just that the juice isn't worth the squeeze. The squeeze is worth on both sides of the equation, from both the cost and the benefits. With that, I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you. Well, thank you both. And we've had a lively chat as you both were talking, so that's good. And that's what this is all about. So let me ask some just basic questions, and then we'll get into a little bit more of a mix. Tell me, and I assume this is a factual question, but you guys both may have differing opinions. So let me first ask David, and then we'll go to Sean. If I'm a guy who's making $250,000 today, what am I paying in taxes? And tomorrow, if this passes, or next week, what would I be paying in taxes? I want to understand, like, what does this actually mean?
Sure. I don't have my chart with me because I've done that math for the different income tax brackets, but I'll just give you one example. So the guy making $250,000, if Prop 208 passes, any taxable income he earns up to $250,000 is not treated any differently than what it is currently. It's only the taxable income above that amount. So let's say that person is making $251,000 a year in taxable income. So in other words, they're $1,000 over the threshold. The 3.5% surcharge only is applied to that $1,000 that's above the threshold. So that person making $251,000 will pay $35 more per year with Proposition 208.
Okay, so David, you had an example of the married couple who are making $650,000. How much are they paying now, and how much are they paying then? What is that number?
Yeah, I actually have that. I can't tell you off the top because how it is, as I mentioned before. So that couple that makes $650,000, and you can do the math, I've done it.
I can't do the math, but that's why I'm asking.
I can look it up while we're answering the questions. But
okay.
So
Sean,
that couple is paying $53,000 at 2.59%. 53,000 of their income is taxed at 3.14. So it's taxed at different amounts. You're not taxed at one rate under our income tax.
Sean, do you have any thoughts on that, or I just want to know
Sure.
how
Yeah.
much
I mean, for a couple
making.
making 650, that's an extra $5,200 in that year as a result of Prop 208. That's the 3.5% of value on top of 500,000, assuming that's their adjusted gross. But this isn't about, onesie twosies couples. This is about the rancher that made $4 million last year because they had the best year that they had in the last 5 years. That's where the rubber really makes the road. And that 4 million was going to go to be future investments in the business and allow that rancher to pivot and do things that's who this really impacts. It's those small businesses that have particularly good years. And so that's huge money to that rancher who had that really good year. It's small money if you barely make more than the limits. But that's not where all the money comes from. You don't get $900 million, a couple $1,000 at a time from random people. We're talking about 2 to 3% of the filers. This is a small group, so we're talking about particularly successful small businesses.
Okay, thanks for clarifying that, you guys. All right, so and this comes from Mayor McFarland from Casa Grande, and thanks for the question. With this, if this passes, where would this rank Arizona in terms of education spending? Like, where are we ranked now, and where would we be ranked with this potential revenue source?
We are currently 48th in the country in per pupil funding. So we've been in the bottom 5 for the past decade. We've been in the bottom 10 for the past 2 decades. If Prop 208 passes, obviously it depends on what other states do. I think it would move us up the rankings, but we're not going to get anywhere near the national average. All of the cuts that we've seen over the past 2 decades, it would take another $4 billion in new annual revenue to get us to the national average. But let me just say, I don't think anyone who's behind Prop 208 recognizes that we need to get to the national average. But what this does do is this gives us the largest investment in public education in more than 20 years. And it addresses the biggest crisis that we have, which is the teacher shortage crisis and the largest class sizes. Sean mentioned that the additional revenue that has been put in recent years, that's not new revenue. That's revenue that was, for the most part, is just restoring cuts that have been made over the past 2 decade. An example, just the year before last, Arizona went into that year with $1 billion revenue surplus. And instead of giving school districts the entire $370 million that they should get for school supplies and curriculum, the legislature gave them half, and they passed a $380 million tax cut. That's the frustration that Arizonans are facing. Even in the best years, when we have $1 billion revenue surpluses, we're still not fully funding our schools.
Sean, do you have any
True.
thoughts
There was
on
no
that?
tax cut. There's been no tax cut in the last few years. There was trimming at the income tax rates from 4.54 to 4.5 and a few others down the line. Everybody got a tiny income tax, but that was as a result of all the new sales taxes everyone was paying. It was just an offset. So if you include the offset amount, you have to look at both sides of the ledger. It's actually been a tax increase. If you look at the revenues coming through from Wayfair, they far exceed the amounts that were trimmed from the income tax. So it's just frankly not true at all that the legislature cut taxes in the last few years. I'm not sure how you could say that the 20% teacher pay raise was restoring cuts. That was all brand new money to the schools. That's $650 million in base funding that schools get every year that goes into the base that can be used for base salaries, something that Prop 208 could not even sniff. None of that goes into the base funding. But I think the question was about education rankings. And it is true that Arizona's been 47 or 48 for a long time, which is purely a math problem. The closest measurement to per pupil spending is wealth adjusted for students. If you take the 51 states and you say what's the per capita wealth, and you divide it by the number of students, Arizona ranks 47. And the bottom 2 states are Utah and Idaho, and the bottom states behind us are Utah and Idaho every year. It's a wealth per student problem. And you cannot materially change that with income tax increases. Now with Prop 208, we might go up 1 or 2 spots. So if you think that Prop 208 is going to make you feel a lot better about where we rank in education, I got bad news for you. You're not going to feel much better about it. That's a math problem that you cannot materially change. That should not be the guiding light. The guiding light should be, how do we have schools that are doing what we would like them to do? How do we make our schools better? Do they have enough to succeed? And if they don't have enough to succeed, what's the sensible way to get there? Not chasing meaningless rankings.
Thank you. So let me ask you this: why should everyone not have a stake in this problem? Why is it that just 1% of taxpayers should burden, shoulder this exclusively? What's the thinking there?
Yeah, so I would strongly disagree with what Sean just said. Our legislature has cut taxes every year, but the pandemic this last session pretty much stopped it since 1990. So our legislature has cut taxes every year, but since 1990, and they did pass a $380 million tax cut 2 years ago. And many of those tax cuts have not gone to everyday Arizonans. I mentioned that we had the largest cuts to public education over the last decade. And in the middle of that, in 2011 and 2012, this is just an example, the legislature, while they were making the biggest cuts to public education in the country, that year in 2012 also passed the largest capital gains tax cuts, which primarily benefit the people in the top 1%. And so what that does is it means that the other 99% of Arizonans have to shoulder more of the costs for funding our public schools and roads and healthcare. And we've seen that many times over the past 30 years, where you've seen special tax breaks that have gone to the wealthiest. And our tax code has gotten very upside down, where that people, the lower you make, our tax code is very regressive. So you are paying a higher percentage of your income in state and local taxes than the people at the top. So Prop 208, what it does is it asks people who have benefited from some of those tax cuts to pay a little bit more and to make our tax system fair.
So let me just restate this. So the 1% should burden or have this exclusively on them because they've gotten the cuts. Is that what you're saying?
Correct. They've been the ones who have benefited the most from many of these tax cuts over the years. And so it's made our tax code upside down, where the people that are lower are paying higher percentage of their income in state and local taxes. So this is really working to make our tax code fair.
Sean, what are your thoughts on that? Thank you, David.
Well, I mean, that's a nice talking point. You'll notice he didn't use specifics because he doesn't have them. Arizona has a progressive income tax already. Most states around us have a flat tax. Arizona already has a progressive income tax. The top 2 to 3% of filers already pay 25 to 30% of the total taxes, despite having less than 15% of the adjusted gross income. They're already paying a lot, certainly more than their fair share from a mathematical perspective. So this is a cash grab. They came up with this idea because they thought it polled well. I want you to get more money for K-12, but guess what? You don't have to play. That's what this whole thing is fundamentally about. It's not because they're right sizing the tax code. It's not because they think that somehow this is going to make our tax code more efficient or fair. This was because this is all of a polling exercise. That's why the Republic endorsed a no. It's because they said this isn't particularly fair. This isn't how you should draw up tax policy. You shouldn't come up with ballot ideas based upon stuff that you think polls well. You should do stuff based upon sound public policy. And so I reject the notion that Arizona has cut taxes targeted for the wealthy. If that was the goal, we'd go to a flat tax, or you would take the top rate down you would take the top rate down faster than you would take down other rates. The reverse has been true. Anytime that they've trimmed income taxes in the state since the early 90s, every single tax bracket got the same treatment, came down by the same percentage point, which meant that the lower incomes actually got a better chunk of the rate cut than hires. It was controversial at the time. There were a lot of folks that said we should cut taxes based upon who pays them. And it was fundamentally decided that they should just cut all the rate groups evenly, which meant that there were higher tax cuts through those rate cuts in the 90s and the 2000s for people at lower incomes. The truth is that in Arizona, if you don't make significant amounts of money. If your adjusted gross income is less than $50,000, you pay very small amounts of state income tax. That's the way our state tax is designed. The vast majority of our revenues is paid for by the middle class. And then the higher echelon and earners pay a lot in terms of percentages. And so the idea that somehow the rich are just getting by in Arizona not paying their fair share is not backed up in the data. It doesn't really make sense when you look at our neighbors and how other states are funded, and it doesn't stand up to scrutiny.
Thanks, Sean. So is this, and I know, Sean, you've said this is not the idea. If we want to increase school funding, this is not the way to do that. David, do you think this is the ideal way? And then I would also ask, maybe to Sean, why did the legislature not step in and try to do something here? Because I know that there's the Voter Protection Act where if we pass this, it's going to be very, very difficult, if not impossible, to change it into the future. And so I know that's a lot of questions into one, but if you could talk a little bit about, is this the ideal way to raise education funding, David? That would be helpful.
Yeah, first of all, I'll just go back to the last one. There is in the Institute of Taxation and Economic Policy, which evaluates all state tax codes, shows that Arizona has the 11th most regressive tax code. They evaluate all state income, local property taxes and sales taxes. In terms of the policy mechanism, so we, as I mentioned, have been working on this for 4 years. And 2 years ago, we said that we were going to be coming to the ballot in 2020 if the legislature or others did not come forward with a better plan. And so our opposition had 2 years. This was no secret of what we were doing. If they had a better plan, to come forward and present that, or to try and go to the legislature. But the fact is that they didn't. And the fact is that they don't really seem to have an interest in addressing the funding crisis in our public schools. I think no matter what policy solution we had come forward with, whether it was a property tax or a sales tax or some combination, because we tried and we looked at and we had conversations with business community people, but there was no interest. And the fact is that they want to just maintain the status quo. And that's what people are frustrated about in Arizona. They're frustrated without a solution. And so this might not be the most perfect solution, but our opposition had 2 years and all the years before that if they thought there was something better, and they didn't. And so here we are. I would also say it's very difficult to raise taxes in the legislature because of the supermajority requirement. It only takes a simple majority to cut taxes, but it takes a 2/3 vote of both chambers in the House and the Senate to raise revenue. So that's also made it very difficult to raise revenue through the legislature, and why you often see people having to go to the ballot to raise revenue.
Sean, your thoughts on legislature, and if this were to pass, if there's any way that it could be modified?
No, there's no modifying this. If it passes, you're stuck with it. And then that's one of the downsides to the initiative process within Arizona. And so if this does the kind of economic damage that we think it does, there's no going back and tweaking this. This is a one and done type of deal. The idea that it was the business community's job to come up with a tax increase after they got kicked off the ballot for 2 years ago is silly. It's not the business community's job to come up with tax increases. The business community has been down at the Capitol arguing for sensible K-12 policy for decades. And we've been at the table for sensible conversations with the responsible leaders within K-12. I've been working with leaders in K-12 to improve it myself for the last 6 years. I don't see those people at the table here. I see the teachers union and I see outside money out of the state. I don't see the superintendents. I don't see the business officials. All of the responsible leaders in K-12 aren't even here for this. This isn't a business community versus K-12. This is Arizona versus outside money. So I'm not that moved by that line of argument, particularly when schools have seen $6.4 billion in aggregate new funding over the last 6 years. When you've seen $650 million ongoing for teacher salaries. Those things have moved the needle. And it was the business community that said, put that money in the base. Don't listen to the teachers union and make it restricted funding. Put that in the base. Let the adults at the schools decide how to spend it and make this ongoing funding that schools can count on. Those are the real things that schools can count on that move the needle going forward. And so the business community will continue to be at the table. We'll analyze each proposition as it comes our way. But the idea that with a gun pointed to our head, we're supposed to like suggest other types of tax increases isn't particularly fair.
Tell me, David, there's been a lot of talk about who is funding the campaign, and I'd ask both of you, who are your major funders, and then why, if it is out-of-state money, why is that? What's the interest of the out-of-state folks?
Yeah, also let me go back. So there are a number of school organizations, including the School Boards Association has endorsed Prop 208. Expect More Arizona has endorsed 208. Helios, school business officials were involved in helping to craft 208. Arizona PTA. So there's a number of school organizations, as well as others across the state, who have endorsed Prop 208. In terms of the funding, this is an Arizona solution for an Arizona problem. The Arizona problem is that no state in the country has cut more funding from our public education system than Arizona. And the Arizona solution is this, because Arizonans are frustrated with the people at the Capitol and others not coming forward with a better solution to fund our schools. And the funding has come primarily from Stand for Children, which is an Arizona organization. They've been in Arizona for more than 15 years. They're an organization consisting of parents in both public and charter schools throughout the state. The funding has come through their national organization, but they are very much an Arizona organization. Similarly, the Arizona Education Association, which is our largest teachers association, and they have received fund, they get their money from teachers. And so this is funded by teachers and parents across the state. The director of the Stand for Children is Rebecca Gao, who worked in the Governor Brewer's administration. She's a Republican. So this isn't some sort of like crazy out-of-state effort. This is very much Arizona-based. I mentioned the organizations that are behind this. Mine, Children's Action Alliance, who's been around for 30 years in Arizona. The Arizona Interfaith Network, which is faith leaders from throughout Arizona. We've been working on this for more than 4 years. And so this is an Arizona coalition very much behind this.
Sean, I'd ask you the same question.
In terms of where's the funding for the opposition?
Yeah, where's your funding? Yeah, for your.
Predominantly from the business community. We have over 75 business organizations opposed to this, including all rural business organizations, everybody from the cattle feeders to farmers groups, to the Cotton Growers Association. So predominantly from business groups and Arizona-based individual donors. Certainly not a bunch of out-of-state money like the Yes Side. All their money comes from out-of-state groups. Stand for Children in Arizona is a tiny organization. Okay, they didn't come up with millions of dollars. This is all coming from the national Stand for Children. The Arizona Teachers Union doesn't have millions and millions of dollars to spend on education. It's coming from the National Teachers Union. And the rest of the groups that Lujan mentioned are not the ones putting the money into the campaign. Okay, the School Boards Association did not endorse this. They've got there's a small PAC, an entirely different group. That's not the School Boards Association. None of them are out there pushing this thing. I don't see elected officials out there pushing this thing. I don't see any superintendents or business association guys out there pushing this thing. All of the adults in K-12, the people that are every day, every year down at the Capitol trying to make the system better, trying to make lives better for our children, the people that have been working on K-12 for years, I don't see any of them pushing this thing. And so this is not the business community versus K-12. This is essentially the business community versus out-of-state funded groups trying to fundamentally change who Arizona is.
And Sean, are you saying that those out-of-state groups are trying to make it so that Arizona is less attractive and their states are more, or what's the motivation there? I don't know.
Oh, I certainly don't think anybody would try to make Arizona less attractive. No, I think that fundamentally they think that high taxes are what drive prosperity. They think that the California model of having high taxes is what can boost public spending and then make your state better. And fundamentally, I don't think that's the Arizona way, and I don't think that is going to work well for Arizona.
We have time for one final question, and this is kind of a conglomeration of questions that Aaron Dorman and a couple others have you heard of companies that have said, I'm going to leave Arizona, or I'm going to move out of Arizona, or even retirees who say, I'm going to move, or I'm not going to come here if this thing passes? And Is there anything like that going on? There's a number of questions privately to me about this.
Sure. Privately, there's several in our coalition who've said that this will change their investment strategy. There's a few who've said that they were already, they were already on the fence about something, and this might be what pushes them over. No one is suggesting that you will see a dramatic, departure of people from Arizona on day one. But slowly over time, it will have impact on the way people choose Arizona, the way people think about Arizona. And no, I'm not going to name names. No company wants to have their name named as threatens to leave over something. Businesses are trying to maintain a positive PR posture, and so I'm not going to name names.
And Jordan, if I could just talk about
Yes,
that.
please, David. Yeah.
So we've heard a lot about that, about people leaving our state or not wanting to come to our state. So the Stanford professor, who is the leading national expert on millionaire migration and how the moving trends of people in that top 1% and how that's impacted by high tax rates. Our opposition quoted his studies in their reports. And that professor's name is Dr. Cristobal Young out of Stanford University. He saw the reports and he basically said they completely misinterpreted his findings, that people that are in the wealthiest 1% tend to move less in response to tax rates. And he evaluated Proposition 208, and his conclusion is that we will continue to see an increase in top 1% wealthy people coming to Arizona if Prop 208 passes. And Sean had mentioned the lack of economists who have weighed in on ours. We actually do. Dr. Enrique Lopez Lira, who's an economist at Grand Canyon University, has weighed in about the supports of education funding. And I would just ask anyone to look at Dennis Hoffman and Tom Rex, who are two economists at ASU, who have not weighed in on this measure specifically, but what they have done. Any report you look at, as Sean mentioned, we used to have an 8% top income tax rate in the 1990s. And any report that they have done has shown that when our income tax was at the highest in the 90s, that on most economic measures, Arizona performed better then than they did today. Not because we had an 8%, but because we were funding our public schools better. In terms of gross domestic product, in terms of wages, Arizona performed better in the 90s when we had that top income tax rate because we were funding our schools better back then.
Well, I thank you, David. Thank you, Sean. What a lively conversation. And you guys were awesome to do this for us. We wish that we were in person eating some breakfast at Harold's beautiful Windmill Winery, and hopefully someday soon we will be. But this is really, really important to our state. And the fact that you both came and gave us your best efforts is fantastic. And I think from Pinal Partnership's perspective, we just want you all to go vote. So everybody go vote. And thank you again. We will see you next month, and stay well. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.